Please welcome Dr. Tom Mihaljevic, CEO and President of Cleveland Clinic, and the holder of the Morton L. Mandel CEO Chair.
Good evening and welcome to Ideas for Tomorrow. Larry Culp is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of General Electric and CEO of GE Aerospace. Now, we all know that General Electric is an iconic company and one of the world's most famous brands. For 130 years, GE products and inventions have changed our lives, from the filaments that lit the first light bulb to the silicon rubber boots that left humanity's first footprints on the moon. Today, Larry is leading a bold transformation of GE that will position it for the future. As the first chief executive from outside of GE, he is dramatically changing the company's structure and culture. Beginning next year, GE will be divided into 3 companies specializing in energy, aviation, and healthcare. Larry's goal is a leaner, simpler, stronger operation that builds on GE legacy of innovation. Please join me in welcoming Larry Culp. Hi, Larry.
Tom, good evening.
Good evening. And welcome to Cleveland, officially.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
Yeah. Well, Larry, what I wanted to start this conversation with is just to maybe ask you a little bit about your background. You obviously have kind of started this, as our video has showed us, if you will, your working career by working in your grandfather's welding shop. Can you tell us a little bit more about how has that framed you or shaped you as a professional, as a person?
Sure. Well, and good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you today. You do your research. My grandfather founded a small welding and machine shop in 1937, just outside of Washington, D.C. in the Maryland suburbs. And I think early on, I just had this wonderful window on what it means to run a business, right? Not part of a business, but an entire business, a very, very small business. And I think it'd be an exaggeration, Tom, to say that is what set me on my path toward general management. But I think the seeds were really planted there in terms of everything that's required for a business to serve and succeed over time. I probably took a lot of different things from that experience, but one tangible thing that I still have is my grandfather's payroll register.
Tell us more.
And that's meaningful to me, because when you go through it, you see names, you see dates, and you see the very modest amount of money my grandfather and my father were paying employees. But that's business, right? Those are real people, real income, supporting real families. And that's never been lost on me. But by the same token, at GE, when I talk about we need to make sure we make payroll, that's rarely in doubt. But there were times, I remember, particularly with my father, where we didn't make payroll. He didn't make payroll, right? So the idea of making sure you're always taking care of a customer, you're covering your costs, is something I always think about when I pull out that register.
So it's deeply ingrained in the way you kind of think about business.
I think so. I think so.
But then a choice of having a formal business education and going through Harvard Business School, how did that prepare you for your first real job in industrial world?
Well, I don't know if I would have ended up in the industrial world without going and getting an MBA. Prior to business school, I'd spent 3 years at what some of you will remember as Arthur Andersen on the consulting side. Those of you who are on the younger side of things won't remember Arthur Andersen at all, unfortunately. But it was a great place. I was on the consulting side, loved working with technology, but didn't really like the advisory side. I wanted to be on the field, on the court. So going to business school gave me that opportunity. But frankly, HBS was the sort of experience for me where I graduated thinking, I know one thing, I'll never actually run a business. This has been such a humbling experience. I've learned a lot, met a lot of great people. Maybe a functional path will really be what I ultimately pursue. But there was enough of a contrarian in me, Tom, at the time, that led me to pursue an industrial path. Because if you remember in the late 80s, I think the video mentioned I graduated in 1990. In the late 80s, the conventional wisdom in this country was our industrial base was on borrowed time. Whether it was the German model, whether it was the Japanese model, U.S. industry was in trouble, and it was likely unrecoverable. That sounded like an opportunity to me. And fortunately, it's played out that way.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about the Harvard Business School. When you and I met for the first time, and we had the dinner at mutual friend's house, we're in the skiing slopes, it happens. You were at the Harvard Business School, but in your kind of a second visit to the Harvard Business School as a faculty.
Right.
Yeah. And that was right after you kind of retired from Danaher.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to hear about that, but before we go there, let's speak a little bit about Danaher, because Danaher is a company who has done extremely well historically, and particularly during your tenure. Yet this is a company that not very many people know much about. I personally first heard about Danaher at Harvard Business School when we were reading a case study about the company well run. And little that I knew is that I would meet a person who was the subject of the case study. Right. But tell us a little bit more about Danaher. What did you do there?
Well, I joined back in 1990, right out of business school. Again, a bit of a contrarian bet, simply because I really liked the people that were there. We were doing about $800 million of revenue. The company had been created through 2 leveraged transactions, so it was a bit of a grab bag, honestly, of different industrial businesses, largely OEM oriented. But we had the good fortune to be one of the first companies, maybe the first company, to begin to work with some of the Toyota masters who had worked with the father of the Toyota production system, Dr. Ono. And over time, we began to make these little businesses a lot better. Our investors were supportive of a reinvestment strategy as opposed to being a big dividend payer or buying back a lot of stock. And that is really how the flywheel at Danaher began to turn. We were operating these businesses using a lot of the Toyota production system techniques better than they had been. We were generating more cash. Investors were encouraging us to reinvest that cash in the businesses. We began to do a number of different things. It's in fact how I ended up spending more time in Cleveland in the mid-90s, because we bought a couple of businesses in the area. And by the time I ended up becoming CEO in 2001, we had really begun to transition from being in a number of businesses to really trying to focus. And we were focused first and foremost in a number of science and technology instrumentation businesses that just had a better financial profile, better growth prospects than some of the more traditional manufacturing, OEM-oriented businesses that had really been the seed corn of the company. And at that time, the flywheel was moving, and fortunately, during the time I was there, we kept it moving.
Yeah. So, you mentioned what was the company like when you took it over as a CEO? Tell us a little bit. What was the company like when you left it?
Well, we were, at the time, back in 01, we were doing like 3.4 billion in sales. We were the world's largest manufacturer of hand tools, mechanics hand tools. We were beginning to get into, again, more sophisticated tools, instruments, if you will, primarily in the environmental field, and then into the test and measurement space, industries that were different, but where a number of the operating characteristics were quite similar. And we really just put that flywheel on high, moved out of some of the lower tech businesses, really ended up being number one in water quality, number one in test and measurement, and then slid in ever so gently into the healthcare space, primarily in both dental and in vitro diagnostics. So by the time that I left 14 years later, we were doing about $20 billion in sales. We'd sold off about half, I think it was about half the company that we had when I started. So depending on how you think about the base, it was a significant growth, combination of organic and inorganic. But again, that same mindset of let's choose the businesses that we're in thoughtfully and well. Let's operate them so that we're realizing the full potential and retain our investors' confidence to reinvest in the business as opposed to pay a big dividend. And that was the flywheel.
You know, I couldn't help by reflecting on when I was kind of going over your bio, and I realized that you became the CEO at the age of 37. I got my first job when I was 38. So I'm thinking about, how do you get as a 37-year of age in front of people who've been in business for a really long time? You're taking on very many established companies. How do you get them to take you seriously? So you have this highly educated, highly motivated, clearly full of energy, capable person. How do you build a street cred at the age of 37?
Well, the question assumes that I did, Tom.
Well,
I think if you go back, one of the great fortunes that was bestowed on me was the opportunity to actually run one of our more important businesses when I turned 30. So I'd been there about 3 years. A company called Veeder-Root was a leader in a number of instrumentation type products in the retail petroleum space. We had a great success there, and I just got general management reps, and I got a lot of them very early in my career. When I started coming to Cleveland, I was looking after a couple of different businesses in addition to Veeder-Root. So it all happened very quickly, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, having the opportunity to just have reps at an early age, not only running a business, running a high growth business, but later on, having a number of businesses that reported to me where functional vice presidents weren't my direct reports, but the CEOs, the presidents were. And that's a different management dynamic. But there were a number of us the board could have chosen to be CEO in 01. One of the things I was most proud of is that the two other gentlemen who were phenomenal executives, older than I was at the time, both stayed with us for about 4 or 5 years. And I think we had a culture that was unique, again, rooted in a number of these Toyota principles that we were all committed to preserving and growing. I'd like to think if they were here, they'd say, Larry treated me as a partner, not as a subordinate. And I think that's really where it started. But part of the job that's so different, you're dealing with investors for the first time, right? You're dealing with a board of directors. That's a different dynamic as well. So it was less, I think, a challenge on the inside, even though at 37 I was probably scared to death, right? The real challenge was what was different about the job.
Yeah. Well, one thing that is interesting, we always think about individual careers is you got shaped by early experiences, and you have clearly been shaped also by this approach to Toyota and approach to engineering and Kaizen and a lean methodology. Is that still with you? I mean, I know the answer to that question, but I have to ask you, it seems that this is something that you really, really firmly believe in and something that you think that U.S. industries, manufacturing in general, can still benefit from. Can you speak a little bit about this approach to lean management and Kaizen in general? It's
in my bones, right? I don't know another way to approach running a business. But it's interesting. Well, maybe we'll talk a little bit about Toyota in the early years at Danaher. But this idea of Kaizen, right? Continuous improvement. I didn't know the Japanese term for it, But I remember distinctly in, I think it was junior high school, a basketball coach making it very clear, you better practice, because in basketball, like in life, you either get better or you get worse. You don't stay the same. And that was one of those early in life realities that stayed with me. It didn't necessarily serve me all that well in my basketball career, but it really came back to me when I was in my early years at Danaher. We'd send a lot of our leadership to Japan to actually spend a week on a manufacturing shop floor leading improvement efforts. And if you've never built an air conditioner in Japan being yelled at in Japanese, you haven't lived, right? I mean, but that was a seminal experience. I think there were some obscenities thrown in there, but who knows? But the intensity around the identification of real customer need, the way they taught us to see and then eliminate waste, and just the complete and relentless focus on the people closest to the work, in that instance, the operators. That really is what defined what became the Danaher business system. Yeah. And it was a way of working, Tom, that allowed us to deliver those results we talked about earlier. But it also defined, I think, a phenomenal corporate culture that really was the secret sauce at Danaher. And I don't know any other way to operate. If I'd gone to, I obviously went to GE, but anywhere I went thereafter, it wasn't as if I was bringing that with me. It's just really who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the bucket list for every aspiring executive is to go to Japan and try to assemble air conditioning units so that it can be yelled down in Japanese.
Yes, something like that.
Something like that. So then obviously after Danaher, you actually retired at relatively early age. You're in your early 50s?
I think I just turned 50.
You just turned 50.
Yeah.
And what are you thinking? Did you have a plan about your post-CEO tenure at the age of 50?
I had a plan. I wasn't going to have a full-time job again. I was going to ski a lot, make up for a lot of fishing I hadn't done. And I was going to put together a portfolio life, a lot of family, a lot of fishing, skiing, and a little bit of teaching, a little bit of investing, private equity. But it was going to be really a portfolio that gave me a lot of flexibility, a lot of free time.
And how did it work for you?
It was great while it lasted. I mean, I can show you on my Epic Pass, I had some really great years in Colorado. Caught more blue marlin than I ever did in my life. But I got this opportunity, given I was spending some time in Boston, to talk to GE about a board assignment. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really have great interest in doing boards, but it was GE. And I had grown up devouring everything I could about GE, about Jack Welch. We never really competed at Danaher, but we were in the same neighborhood. And one thing led to another, and I joined the board in early 2018. Again, strongly of the view that, okay, this is going to take up a little bit of time, but I'm still going to Costa Rica. I'm still going to Colorado. Yeah. I'll still be in class.
And?
Well.
And then you joined the board. You were on the board for not even a full year.
A matter of months.
A matter of months.
Yeah. So I think my first board meeting was April or May of 18. It was a tumultuous time for the company. We were in the process of resetting the board in a number of ways. We had a board of 18 that became 9, then 12. Later that summer, I became the lead director. And as the board went through some, as you would imagine, some of you may well know, some serious deliberations, there was a decision taken to look for a new CEO. And I promise you, I tried hard. I said no twice. But on the 1st of October, we made an announcement that I was the new chairman and CEO of GE. So it was what, 5, 6 months?
5, 6 months.
It
Pretty
flew.
intense. It flew by. So, and then you became the first outsider CEO in
Yes.
130 years long history, storied history of General Electric.
Well, I saw in the video, back to Edison.
Yes.
No pressure, mind you, right? Thomas Edison.
Yeah. No pressure. No pressure. So you're approaching clearly an iconic company in crisis, probably the biggest crisis since the inception of the company. Why did you decide to actually take the job? I mean, it was clearly very, very challenging times. Obviously, anything that happens to GE is widely publicized. Why did you take the job? Because it was going to take you away from skiing and fishing for quite some time.
Well, you know, the irony, if I can just, as a quick aside, I was teaching in the fall of 18. So I was about a month in to my class at HBS. And I had been talking to the dean. He's a very close friend of mine.
Nathan Noria at the time.
So I was teaching the class that Nathan taught me back in the fall of 88 when I was a first year and he was a first year professor. So we have a great relationship, and Nathan, of course, was encouraging me to do this for all the right reasons. And then once we made the announcement, Nathan, of course, said, "But you're going to finish the semester, right?" Nathan, no, but that's a story for another day. I think, Tom, in many respects, in all seriousness, I went on the board because GE is GE. It's an incredibly important company that was at a place and time where I thought I could help. I think over the course of that summer and early fall, that became all the more evident to me, right? I was in no way keen to get back to a full-time job. You know, frankly, if I was, the last way I wanted to do that was through the boardroom. And I wasn't a fan of that. So the board came twice and asked, would you do this? I said, I think I can find somebody far better, but I don't think this is right for me at this moment. I had an opportunity to visit a business that August. And my wife, Wendy, and I were flying back from the visit, and I think she could see in my eye a lot of pressure, uncertainty, all of that, but this is a place that's got great bones, really, really strong people. This is within the realm of the possible. Yeah. And I think she may have seen that before I saw it in the mirror. And then, the third time, I was ready to go. But again, in many respects, for the same reasons I joined the board. Because it's such you talked earlier about what the company does. Yeah. You think about our role in healthcare and aerospace, let alone in energy. I mean, this is an incredibly important company, not only to our country, but really the world. Yeah. And I say that with humility, not arrogance. Back in 18, there were a lot of people who didn't think that really mattered. I thought it mattered a lot, and I appreciate that all the more today.
So every time you join any organization, you have this, so to say, perception of the organization before you join it. Right. And then you get in, and then you're kind of comparing and contrasting the perception that you've developed over time with this new knowledge. What surprised you at GE? What was something that you anticipated to see? What was a surprise to you?
I think a number of people assumed that being on the board for 5 or 6 months gives you infinite wisdom. And I think those of you that just laughed obviously have been on boards. Those of you didn't may not have that experience. But I just thought it really was humorous. I'm just jumping in. But directionally, I think the challenges were clear, right? We had this incredible amount of leverage that needed to be brought down dramatically and fast. And we really needed to get back to basics with respect to running the business. I saw that at a distance. I saw it up close. So that was what I had expected. I don't think I had a full appreciation for just how good the team was. smart, driven, capable. And the people who were there in the fall of 18 had obviously been to hell and back, right? Committed, passionate, in love with the company. To see that up close, even to this day, is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I don't think I had a full appreciation for the different ways in which we were pursuing the benefits of scale at the expense of the benefits of focus. And that's a little bit of a contrast, I think, in the way we had run Danaher and the way we've been running GE over the last several years.
Yeah. Could you elaborate a little bit about that, the difference between the benefits of scale and the benefits of focus, and how do you think about it? Because I think that's the leading thought that kind of defined several subsequent steps in your management of GE.
Well, I remember where I came from, right? Danaher, a company no one had ever heard of. The brands that our customers coveted were really the individual businesses. So when I was CEO, we probably had 50 different discrete brands or P&Ls. And we never lost sight of the fact that that was the stove face, right? Customers buying things brand by brand on a daily basis. There were certainly things we did together as Danaher that you might think of as synergy or the benefits of scale. But we managed, the way I think about it, vertically, Tom. We were just as focused as we could be on the customer and the P&L. I think there were times and places at GE, and GE is obviously exponentially larger than Danaher, where there was a focus on making sure that we used the full strength and weight of GE, which certainly yielded benefits, but I think at times could lead us to focus inwardly as opposed to on the outside. And it was that, if you will, that pivot from a horizontal focus or pursuit of scale toward a vertical orientation around the businesses with the customers in mind that has really been, I think, the heart of the operating model evolution. Now, some people would say it's not evolution because that's the way the company operated in times past. Yeah. I don't really have any perspective on that, but I just know that if you take care of the customer, good things tend to follow.
Yeah, because you could, if for those who, and very many here in the audience know GE very well, that is almost like coming full circle to the roots of the company, the way it used to be in the years past, was to some extent. But obviously, GE being so large and so influential company for the U.S. economy, for the world economy, obviously now we're going into this next phase where the company is going to become three different companies. How was that an obvious decision for you or a path forward when you took on the job, or is that something that materialized in the early months of your tenure? Because you made that decision actually relatively quickly.
Well, remember when I joined the board in the spring of 18, and a couple of us joined then, the plan of record was to try to do something with our healthcare business. Yeah. You go back to the summer and early fall of 18, I think what became all the more clear was the enormous amount of debt that we were carrying was really going to make anything strategic along those lines near impossible. So it wasn't necessarily a time back in the fall of 18 for grand strategy. It was really a time for deleveraging and focusing on running the businesses better. So you may recall that's when we made the pivot from doing an IPO or a spin of the healthcare business to selling a small part of the bioprocessing business within healthcare for $20 billion to generate cash, which was really the first critical step in bringing down by just over $90 billion our debt load. That was coupled with the work that we were doing pre-COVID and then through COVID on just getting back to that vertical orientation, running the businesses better. that enabled us through the course of all of last year to really think strategically about what we wanted to do, which led to the announcement we made a year ago with respect to the three-way split. So it was always out there as a possibility, but I can't say that the board really spent any meaningful time through 1920 thinking about what were we going to do when we grew up. We really needed to focus on the basics. And then, of course, the pandemic put everything under even more pressure.
Yeah. And the first company that is going to be formed as an independent company is going to be GE Healthcare.
Indeed. Yeah. 40 days from now,
40
I'm told.
40 days from now. 40 days from now. So now we're here in a healthcare organization. What makes you excited about GE Healthcare as an independent company?
Well, I think I'm excited about GE Healthcare, and I'm even more excited about GE Healthcare on its own. I mean, it sounds trite to say this to you and obviously this audience, but this is an incredibly important and precious business, given what we do to support what you do in turn for patients and their families the world over. I shared with you earlier, I was at the RSNA meeting earlier today in Chicago, the Radiological Society of North America, just to see up close all the innovations that we're bringing to market and to know that will impact people's lives so directly. You don't get to do that in a lot of businesses. Yep. When I'm out in the market, when I'm in New York with investors, it still boggles my mind, Tom, how little so many know about GE Healthcare. Right? It's a big business, nearly $20 billion in revenue annually, but it's tucked away inside of this industrial business that's had a lot of change over the last several years. So the opportunity for the world, and not just investors, but really for everyone, to see GE Healthcare on its own bottom, right, with the full spotlight on it, I think is going to be motivating. It's going to be challenging, but ultimately rewarding for the team if we do what we're capable of. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure we will.
So it's an interesting challenge for you, and I had a privilege of watching, from kind of a close position about how do you manage this complexity that GE is currently in. So iconic company, first you had to deleverage it in order to position it for a three-way split. And now, in a short order, 3 companies need to be spun out, 3 different boards, 3 different executive teams. And by the way, we need to run all of those businesses in real time and continue to improve it. You do in a macroeconomic environment that is, let's say, at least challenging, to put it mildly. How do you sort through all of that?
Well, I think what I would start with is it's not just me.
Of course.
Right. We really have a tremendous team at corporate and within the businesses. I think one of the rallying cries for us from day one was simply, we are one company until we're not. So no breakaway republics, no self-serving political behavior. That's an easy way to be kicked off the team. And at the same time, we really talked to a host of people who went out who had done this before. And one of the I think the best, most frequent bits of advice we got was try to keep to a minimum the number of people who are focused on the spins, the corporate transactions. Keep as many people as you can focused on running the businesses day in and day out. So I don't know if that's a 90-10 or a 95-5 split, but we've worked very hard to have dedicated teams who are doing the one-time work so that the rest of us can spend the vast majority of our time doing what we've always done and will do into the future. It hasn't been perfect, Tom, but I think by and large, those 2 watchwords have served us well. But it's been a busy year, no question. And then, of course, everything that has come at us this year, Ukraine, inflation, it just seems to keep coming.
Yeah.
But back to just the sheer resilience and the
Yeah.
strength of the GE teams, we'll get this done.
Let's just ask a favorite question for any CEO of large global company. What's your midterm view of global economy?
I think it's going to be a bumpy ride in 2023. I just think that the central banks, not only here but around the world, maybe with the exception of China, are really going to have to put the brakes on the economy if we're going to get inflation under control. People see those rate increases. We'll see what the Fed does here between now and the end of the year. But I think everybody knows that with monetary policy, it takes a while for the slamming of those brakes to be felt. We're seeing some of that here and there. We don't really see much of that today at GE, but it's hard to think that it isn't coming, not only here in the US, but more broadly. So short to medium term, I think it's going to be choppy. I think those companies that are embracing that reality, continuing to do what they can to control costs while innovating, will, as always is the case, will do well. But it's time to buckle up.
So before we open it up for audience for their questions, I'd just like to ask you kind of of a general question. We obviously touched upon so much that you've done throughout your career, but when you teach at HBS or you speak to your executive teams or junior executives or your peers, what would be your advice for kind of a successful path in roles like yours? What are your experiences that would result in any advice for anyone here in the audience as they kind of strive to become successful or be more successful in their jobs?
Well, I'd go back to this idea of reps, right? And this would be a frequent conversation on campus. How do I become a CEO? Right? I'm going to go do a bunch of things, and then when I turn 45 or 50, can I be a CEO? It really helps to get reps in, to manage teams, to manage businesses, because it's rare that someone just slides into a CEO role without some of that type of experience somewhere along the way. Tom, I'm a big believer in the best leaders being great listeners, right? And that was something at HBS that, because of the case method, we had an opportunity not only to encourage, but to really model in the classroom, both in the way one would ask a question, to frame a discussion, but also just demonstrating what active listening is really all about. And I'd say finally, and again, this gets back a little bit to some of the teaching experience, you have to get the answers to the what questions right. But the how questions are far more difficult over time, right? And it's easy to over-index on the what and leave the how, the messy how, answers to others. And I think you just leaders who pay attention, who care not only about how that work is done, but who's doing that work, are the ones that build the best teams and deliver the best results over time.
Clearly. Well, thank you very much. And now I'll open the podium for questions. We can light it up. We have the first question over there.
Hi, I'm Bill. I do research here at the clinic. Just want to say thank you again for coming down and talking with us. It's really a fascinating story, and I appreciate you sharing like the big picture sort of things that led to your success, but do you have any sort of maybe daily habits or routines that have served you well in you becoming the CEO of GE?
This is getting personal fast.
Thank you.
No, it's good, Bill. Thank you. I think that two things that come immediately to mind. One, I'm fortunate that I'm an early riser. It is probably my most productive time of the day. And I really like to make sure that before I go to bed at night, that I'm clear as to what my priorities are for the next day. And as simple and as commonsensical as that might sound, those are habits that I think have served me well.
Define early.
4:30, give or take.
It is early. Okay, Stefan?
I thought everybody here got up much earlier than that.
No, well, I just that's why I asked you. Define early, yes, because people here are relatively used to getting up early. So, Stefan.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here in Cleveland today. The question I have for you, well, first I want to compliment you on deleveraging before interest rates rose. So that was brilliant, and I think your stock price is going to continue to climb. I can't imagine what your debt service cost would be if you had $90 billion of extra debt today. So bravo.
Exactly.
So the question I have for you is about global supply chains. You know, you're a global company. You have parts coming from all over the world that you're assembling, and you have global customers. And given sort of the move towards deglobalization, I'm just curious on what your view is on how GE will navigate this, given both, again, supply chain issues and customer issues coming from all over the world.
Well, I would say that the environment that we face today could not be more challenging. There really isn't a place on earth, there isn't a commodity, a good that we buy that hasn't been dramatically shaken by everything that's happened, I think, in the wake of the pandemic. When you couple that, at least for our businesses, with the demand trends that really do defy, I think, maybe the near-term economic outlook, right? Our aerospace business, we can't make enough engines given the demand for new planes. The planes that are out there are flying nearly at 2019 levels, with the exception of China. So there's great demand in the aftermarket as well. Our healthcare business has stood up quite well. As you would imagine with the energy transition, there's a lot happening there. So it's really challenging. And then on top of all of that, you've got the concerns about deglobalization, regionalization, and the like. I think what we're trying to do is simply, first and foremost, not blame suppliers. Let's figure out who can do what to help us in the short term. Let's not have any outsized expectations. Let's help and problem solve where we can, but recognize that as things settle out, if we do get a bit of a slowdown, in all likelihood, given that you no longer have the extreme wage arbitrages that probably marked the last 20 years, there are a host of reasons, a host of non-political reasons, where you probably are going to have more balanced supply chains with an orientation to simply being closer to the customer, to serve the customer more rapidly, and your costs are going to settle out in, I think, in a more balanced equilibrium. But it's going to be, I think, choppy again, particularly here in the short term. I could go on and on. I won't. I promise, about the various things that we have to do today in our own shops, with our suppliers, with our suppliers, to just work our way through these incredible supply chain challenges. I've never seen anything like it.
Mr. Culp, thank you for being here and for the great advice that you are providing us. I just wanted to ask you, many of the people here, we are physicians, we spend the day seeing patients, but at the same time, we want to grow our leadership skills, we want to get closer to business, deal with companies, pharmaceutical companies, and all of that. We are well known for our lack of knowledge about how to do business in general, being physicians. So to what degree you think getting an MBA, getting into that area is something that nowadays is a must, or having just the right team around you will be enough?
I don't think an MBA really for anybody is a must. I can say this to someone with an MBA, I have to imagine med school is a heck of a lot harder than business school. So in terms of capability, I'm not sure I would think of an MBA as a prerequisite for any sort of commercial engagement or success. But having a team around you who perhaps has some of those experiences, depending on what sort of endeavor you're talking about, and just engaging with what I believe to be core skills that so many in the profession have, should enable you to get pretty far down the path toward whatever specific goals that you might have. But to think that you have to go check a box in that regard could be helpful if it's the right program, but I wouldn't see it as an imperative in that way.
Thank you. I will try to get my money back.
I've been set up.
Okay, so let's just, the next question, please.
I would like to ask you, as the CEO of Aerospace, as we've been seeing more companies take roles in the space industry that have been typically reserved for government, where do you see the role of private companies versus the government in that space, and where do you see GE Aerospace in that ecosystem with the companies that exist?
Well, today, GE Aerospace doesn't really do much in space per se, right? It's fundamentally a commercial engine business with a sizable military business, which is primarily military engines. So a lot of what we do in that business, as you would imagine, is with the government as customer. But whether it's the DoD, whether it's NASA, there's a lot of core capability, even at the DOE, that the government has helped nurture and develop over time. So that's I think a critical role, not only in terms of the innovation ecosystem that we're a part of within aerospace, but frankly that applies in our energy business, where there are some overlapping capabilities, and in healthcare as well, as you would appreciate. If we end up going into the space sector, I'm sure that will be all the more the case. But if you look at what's happened over the last 10 years, right, there's been a lot of commercial space innovation that has been supported, but not wholly funded by NASA and the federal government.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take first one from my right side, please.
Thank you again for being here. So just thinking about taking over GE, you know, obviously had some challenges, you need to make some big impact quickly, and had to bring hundreds of thousands of employees along. Could you talk about how you communicated? I mean, I can imagine with your grandpa's garage, you know, it was sort of a toolbox talk, you could get everybody together, but you had to reach people around the world and get them on your management operating system and cadence. So could you share your approach?
No, that's exactly right. And even at Danaher, right, I'd been there for 25 years, ran a lot of the businesses. They were smaller businesses. This was just a completely different dynamic. I would say that there were a number of channels, a number of mechanisms that were already in place. So reaching the GE team everywhere and anywhere in the world was not difficult. It was really more helping them through the additional change that my appointment represented, let alone everything that followed, both in terms of the things we've touched on with respect to the deleveraging, and in turn the way we were going to run the business. I think what I tried to do was simply be as straightforward as to where we were and what we were going to do as I possibly could, and not really rely wholly on the outstanding communications team that we have, but get out with the businesses, in the businesses. You saw some pictures earlier. I don't know where you got those, by the way. Being out on shop floors, being in operating reviews, just trying to really walk the talk, if you will, at a retail level as opposed to a wholesale level, so people could begin to see what I was all about, what I was hoping that we might do together as a team. And over time, I think we've been able to reinforce some of those early messages with progress, examples, and then, of course, other voices along the same lines.
Thank you.
The last question, Gina.
Thank you for visiting Cleveland Clinic and sharing your leader journey. One of my most memorable and inspiring site visits at Cleveland Clinic was visiting GE Crotonville. And I know that decision must have been incredibly difficult. So would love to hear more about how you approach that, as well as how you're developing your internal pipeline of leaders now at GE.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Crotonville is the global GE learning headquarters, hard on the Hudson River, just north of New York City. It really is famous in so many appropriate ways in corporate development history. We've recently announced that we're going to sell the Crotonville campus. Frankly, over the last several years, particularly with the pandemic, it was an underutilized asset. But I think, again, back to the spirit of focus versus scale, the businesses were beginning to really tailor and craft their development agendas around their discrete missions, talent needs, and the like. So Crotonville was becoming a little bit of a part of the past, not necessarily a part of the future. And let's face it, there's so much you can deliver in terms of content today digitally. The idea of bringing everybody together was also something that was happening less frequently. But to your question, development has always been, I think, less about Crotonville or any classroom and more about what happens OJT, right, on the job. So a lot of what we've tried to do, getting back to some great GE history, is really make sure we're planful about the types of roles we give our up-and-coming talent, to make sure they've got great bosses, they have real challenges, and they own their results. Jack Welch, one of my other predecessors, used to talk about popcorn stands. The small businesses that maybe didn't matter, but like the first business I ran, were a great laboratory, great classroom to learn how to run a real business. We don't have that many popcorn stands anymore. So we've looked to create those sorts of opportunities where people can run real P&Ls of a more modest size to get them ready for the bigger leadership jobs of the future. And I think all three of the businesses will do more of that as we go forward.
Thank you.
Well, Larry, thank you so very much for being here. Thank you for sharing your insights and experiences. We really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.
Good, thanks.